From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers. Today's news talk, The Pulse.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. It's a Thursday the 20th of February. And as always, here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and indeed controversial issues of our time. My mission is to provide more light and less heat in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth and to inform, educate, and indeed entertain with dignity and respect. And as I always say, it's vital we don't just ask the questions, but question those answers. Well, today we're going to look at the latest developments in Ukraine and Russia, also talk about Iran and the Middle East, talk about those hostages and so on and so forth. And I got two stellar guests yet again. Larry C. Johnson is a former analyst at the US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and a recognized commentator on national security topics. After serving 4 years at the CIA, he transitioned to the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism, and in 1993 he left government and basically to enter into the private sector, where he has built a dual career as a business consultant and an intelligence pundit. He's also CEO and co-founder of the BERG Associates, LLC, and a co-founder of veteran intelligence professional for Sanity. Larry, known for his commentary on a host of important global issues, including terrorism, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, US foreign policy, and more, has appeared on various podcasts and radio television programs, and he always says in all his interviews that his favorite is appearing on the Muckrakers with Andrew Eborn. So lucky him, he's back tonight. Peter Fawn is a veteran. He's a regular here on the Andrew Eborn Show. They always say he's from a working class family in the northwest of England. We say we're going to put it on the map. We're going to talk about that a bit in a moment. But opportunities created by Harold Wilson's government enabled him to have a successful career in the Foreign Office, serving as British ambassador to Bahrain in 1999 to 2003, and then Syria in 2003 to 2006, before he retired and dedicated his time to coming on the Andrew Eborn Show on a regular basis. He's a lifelong socialist and former member of the Labour Party. After retiring, Peter worked for UNRWA, where he was its representative in the Arab world, fundraising millions in aid for the Palestinian people. We're going to start with you, Peter. It's always good. Thank you very much for coming back on the show. As always, what's really helpful, because so much is evolving as we speak, and we keep monitoring that here about what's going on in Ukraine. Let's start off by putting it into historical context. Talk to me about Ukraine. How did the conflict start, and what's your perspective as to the current position?
Well, the key thing is that the conflict didn't begin 3 years ago, as the Western powers tend to make out. The conflict didn't begin even back in 2014, when there was a US-engineered coup known as the Maidan coup in Ukraine. It began much earlier, in fact, around the turn of the century, with the push of NATO towards the east and the absorption of a dozen former Soviet satellites, as they used to be called, into the bosom of NATO countries like Estonia and Lithuania and Poland, all of them pretty rabidly anti-Russian and keen to make NATO even more anti-Russian than it was already. And back in about 2005, I think it was, NATO declared an intention eventually to offer membership to Ukraine. This is when it all started to go horribly wrong. That was a country, a satellite too far for the Russians. This, they thought, would be a dagger pointed at Moscow. The Ukrainian frontier is only, I think, about 300 miles from Moscow, and the idea that they could have NATO missiles on their doorstep with very, very few seconds to prepare for a potential attack was anathema to the Russians. So for over a decade, they quietly, diplomatically struggled against this. All the while, things were becoming more complicated because the Ukrainians were behaving abominably towards their Russian speakers in the provinces closest to Moscow, the Donbass, as it was called. And in the end, Russia's patience snapped when there was the coup, and Russia took over at that point the Crimea. Now, if anybody has even a passing knowledge of Russian literature, they will appreciate that Ukraine was always considered part of Russia. It has been, until very recently, Russian has been the main language throughout the country, and still a very sizable minority of Ukrainians have Russian as their first language, and in Crimea it was about 98%. So you have to look at the emotional attachment of Russia to these lost provinces, as well as the military realities. Closer to the present day, Russia did attempt to negotiate with Ukraine when the conflict in the Donbass appeared to be coming to a head, and Ukraine started massing huge forces on the edge of Donbass to go in and quell the Russian-speaking area. But the Ukrainians were uncompromising, and that was the last straw for Mr. Putin. And that's when it all kicked off with the so-called special military operation, which is a bit of a joke term. But you have to remember, of course, it's been a war, a fully fledged war. But you have to remember that for Russia, this was comparable to our war in Northern Ireland, where we too were trying to quell an insurrection by an army, the Irish Republican Army. So let us not mock too much the way the Russians call this war a special military operation. The conflict has dragged on, as we all know. It's become a World War I type trench warfare almost. But in the last 18 months, Russia has made steady progress. It's a meat grinder on the front, and they are steadily, day by day, eating into Ukrainian territory. And in military terms, the Ukrainians seem to have very little hope of prevailing. And therefore, it makes eminent sense for someone to come in and say, well, let's make peace.
Yeah, I mean, you say, Peter, very little hope. I think there's no hope at all of Ukraine prevailing. There's an inevitability about it. As we've said from day one, the extraordinary thing is that it's taken this length of time. But I want to bring Larry Johnson in here. I mean, the current reports is that Trump is very frustrated with Zelensky for allegedly failing to take the opportunity of a US brokered peace. Larry, welcome to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. What's your view on it?
On Ukraine. Last week's 1-2 punch, first by Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, speaking to the NATO Ministers of Defense meeting, followed up by J.D. Vance's address to the Munich Security Conference. Those were, as Ambassador Ford knows, those kinds of presentations. They didn't sit down and scribble them on the back of an envelope on their way to the meeting. They didn't just say, oh, I've got a great thought. These were carefully coordinated and scripted. And so this was a coordinated message that Trump was sending both to Ukraine and to Europe. The message to Ukraine was, going forward, the United States isn't giving you anything else. If you want it, Europe's got to buy it and give it to you. number one. Number two, there's not going to be any U.S. troops in there. Number three, you're not going to be part of NATO. Number four, if the Europeans decide to go in and provide you any kind of military assistance, that's on them, but it's not going to be covered under Article 5. So good luck, boys. You're on your own. And then J.D. Vance turned around and delivered what I thought was an essential message to these European elite. Let me give you a very simple illustration. I was in Moscow twice in the last year, between December and then prior to that, or last June, I was in St. Petersburg. I could go into Red Square. I could kneel down and pray, both verbally out loud or silently. And you know what would happen to me? Nothing. However, if I go to London and go outside Parliament and do the same thing, I'm getting arrested and possibly going to prison. Who's the authoritarian? Who's the dictator? Not Putin. And so that's part of the message that Vance was delivering, that the West has gotten itself into this condition where they are supporting a Nazi-loving, I'll call him a pseudo-Jew, because he really wasn't raised Jewish, and he doesn't even confess Judaism as his faith. And yet he associates and embraces neo-Nazis. He is a dictator in the genuine sense of the word, that there is no political party in opposition that's allowed to oppose him. I mean, heavens, even during World War II, even though they say, well, there were no elections in Great Britain, yes, but it was a coalition government headed by Churchill, but representing members of all parties. Churchill wasn't locking up the Tories at the time. He may have wanted to, but he didn't. And so it was, even in that wartime environment, Great Britain, at least at that time, exhibited the kind of tolerance for opposition views. Zelensky has locked up political opponents. He's silenced political opposition parties. He has persecuted the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and literally attacked and jailed priests. So, enough of this nonsense. And then when he comes out and claims that he's got 57% support, but he can't hold elections because it's wartime, please, if he had that size of support, he could easily hold elections. But that survey that was done, it was paid for by USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, CIA fronts. Okay, no credibility there. And the question that was asked, that what they did, the way the methodology was, the surveyor called people up, so they knew got your phone number. So it's like, hey, Andrew, I got your phone number. I'm calling you up. Do you support President Zelensky? Yeah, I support him. Okay, what's shocking is that Zelensky, with that methodology, only got 57% support. You'd think it'd be closer to 90. So.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's the way they do these surveys. Do you love him? Do you love him a lot? Or do you love him more than your mother? And those are usually the sort of questions, are they?
Absolutely.
It is extraordinary. But Peter, we spoke a bit just before we came on air about the cancellation of this news conference, which Washington, basically, there was supposed to be a news conference. Washington apparently asked for this to be axed after Zelensky met with the U.S. envoy. What's your take on that?
Well, it was obviously going to be a frost. There was no way that Zelensky could put a positive gloss on what he'd just heard, unless he was lying. And in that case, his guest would have had to call him out for lying. So I think the guest did the only sensible thing, which was to pull the plug on the whole idea of a press conference. It would have been embarrassing and ludicrous.
Yeah, and it is really strange because there's this massive strain between the US narrative and you talked, Larry, about Zelensky and his popularity with all the people phoning around, and in the 50s they did it. Trump says his popularity is 4%. Where's that figure come from?
Well, I actually think it's probably reflective of accurate U.S. intelligence, because, again, this other number was a complete fabrication. And let's just think through the logic of it. If he genuinely does have overwhelming popular support, as a 57% figure would indicate, then heavens, you can absolutely hold elections. He would be guaranteed victory. But they're not holding elections because this whole Ukraine matter is headed south and headed south fast. The Ukrainians have been very good at one thing, and they have worked in league with both my old outfit, the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as the United Kingdom's MI6, in producing information operations to mislead the public. And that has convinced everybody over the years that the Russians their economy is in tatters, that their military is inept, incompetent, and suffering staggering casualties, and that Putin is going to drop over dead any minute now. He has any number of maladies that would, put any other normal human being under the earth, but somehow he's managed to soldier on in the face of heart disease, cancer, hemorrhoids, and the heartbreak of psoriasis. So it's remarkable, but I do give the Ukrainians credit for this effective campaign, because the people, the average citizen in the United Kingdom has been grossly misled, and they can't help themselves not believing the reality of what's on the ground, because they have been fed such a load of lies over the period of time. And a similar phenomena here in the United States.
I always say, and it's common, that the first casualty in war is the truth, and that's what I love about the Muckrakers. We get experts like yourself and Peter on to unpack all of that. We're going to take a quick break. When we do come back, we're going to be talking about the Kremlin's reaction to Starmer and his suggestions about putting troops on the ground. Don't touch that dial.
Critically analyzing global affairs, the Muckrakers. Today's news talk, The Pulse.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers. Me, Andrew Eborn, Larry Johnson, and Peter Ford are joining me today to unpack the latest situation in Ukraine. We're also going to be looking at the Middle East and Gaza as well. But I mentioned just before the break about the Kremlin branding Starmer's suggestion about putting troops on the ground as unacceptable. Well, that's not surprising, is it, Peter?
Absolutely not. And it was absolutely infantile on the part of Starmer to put this forward. What made him think for a second that Russia could accept British or any other NATO boots on the ground in large numbers, effectively to send reinforcements to the Ukrainian army, with no conception of what peacekeeping actually means. It's generally small numbers of monitors. It's not several battalions sent to stiffen the Ukrainian lines and be prepared to attack Russia. What made him think that Russia, having fought this war precisely to prevent this kind of scenario, NATO troops on his doorstep, what made him think that this stupid idea would fly? It was absolutely infantile, but it illustrates the point Larry was making about how the British have been telling themselves lies. They've been in denial about the situation, failing to see the most obvious things. We've been absolutely, with apologies to the autistic, unable to see the other side's point of view at all, arrogant and short-sighted.
Well, it is interesting. So we talk about, as soon as you've got one member of NATO taking part in the conflict, it sounds like all members of NATO are supposed to take part. Larry, what do you think it means to have British boots on the ground? What would a UK-Europe force in Ukraine look like?
Well, first of all, it would be a miracle if it could even happen. the reality is the British military is in such a dismal state that, Starmer is reminiscent of one German corporal with a mustache that was moving imaginary armies around on the board back in April of 1945, armies and personnel that didn't exist. Starmer is seeming to do the same thing because, the total British military strength right now, last I checked, was approximately 70,000. Now, out of that 70,000, if you could even cobble together 10,000 that are combat capable, and it's not just that you can get the bodies lined up, but do you even have the logistics chain to put them into position and sustain them in the field, apart from arming them? I've seen some articles over the past week in the UK that indicate from military leaders going, wait a minute, we don't have the weaponry, we don't have the artillery, we don't have the tanks. You're deploying a mythical force. This would be a great movie if it was like the great late Peter Sellers playing it. But unfortunately, he's passed. We need him back to bring some sanity to this madness.
I know you're absolutely right. Well, look, it's nearing its third anniversary, isn't it? What's going to be the realistic outcome we can expect for Ukraine under the new Trump administration? Let's start with you, Peter.
Well, I'll tell you what it will not be first. It will not be security guarantees in any shape or form. And I'm afraid even some relatively sensible commentators are just assuming that there are going to be security guarantees. Show me any conflict in the last century which has ended with security guarantees. I can't think of a single one. The guarantee comes from the terms of the treaty. Eventually, if there is to be peace, there will be a treaty. And the sensible way forward would be to aim at a treaty similar to the Treaty of Neutrality, which is Austria's guarantee. What could be Ukraine's fate, how awful that would be, to be like Austria, quiet, prosperous, getting on with its own life, not welcoming NATO troops, not prodding the bear. What would be wrong with that? That would be Ukraine's best guarantee, but they will not be given security guarantees by NATO because Russia would not settle on those terms. If anything, it's Russia that will be demanding security guarantees against further NATO expansion. So you can take security guarantees off the table and start to be realistic about a status of neutrality.
Well, which sort of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, what's your take on what a peace deal might look like, Larry?
It will resemble more the end of World War II with a surrender by Ukraine. I think, the problem here is it's great that the United States and Russia finally opened negotiations. As Ambassador Ford remembers, during the entirety of the Cold War, I mean, at the height of Vietnam, when the Soviets were actually supplying the North Vietnamese with weapons and even pilots and killing Americans, the United States still found a way to talk to the likes of Brezhnev and others, and Andropov. We still had diplomatic relations, and even out of that came some important arms control agreements. What has transpired really over the last 8 years, and Trump is share some of the blame in this, was this refusal to talk, to engage. I actually had the privilege of speaking to one of the senior members of the Russian foreign ministry a year ago, December. And he said very clearly, he says, we don't have anybody to engage with, anyone to talk to. So what is happening now with the discussions between Russia and the United States is it's putting the relationship back on a normal track. That said, that's not going to lead to a quick resolution of the war in Ukraine, at least from a diplomatic standpoint, because the military initiative relies with Russia. Russia is moving quicker. And I think the fact that it's going to sink in that the United States is no longer writing blank checks to the Ukrainians, nor supplying weapons at just on demand, that this is going to lead to some fairly significant fissures within the military hierarchy in Ukraine. I wouldn't be surprised to see something like a coup directed against Zelensky, but the Russians are in control of this process. They'll dictate the terms. Ukraine's not going to have a position to ask for anything, or they can ask much like the Germans asked at the, say in May of 1945.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, interesting stuff. We will continue looking at this and what peace might settle, what might look like. But as everybody says, look, membership of NATO, and even if it was granted, the reality, Trump's basically turned around and say, look, he's probably no longer going to support NATO. So what does that really mean? We're going to take a quick break for the news headlines. We'll be straight back after this to talk about Gaza. Do not touch that dial.
Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk.
For the Pulse, this is James O'Neill. President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky have exchanged accusations regarding the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Israel is set to begin talks for the second phase of a Gaza ceasefire, focusing on exchanging remaining living hostages held by Hamas for Palestinian prisoners, as announced by Foreign Minister Gideon Saar on February 18th. Danish Prime Minister Frederiksen announced a significant increase in military spending in response to the growing European security concerns, allies to shoulder more of their own defense costs.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined by Larry Johnson and Peter Ford. Let's turn our attention, gentlemen, to Gaza. And as I always do here on the Muckrakers, we try to put this into historical context. It's always useful because people just hear the headlines. Talk to me then, Larry, about the history of the conflict between Gaza and that sort of side.
Well, if you want to go all the way back to 70 AD, when the Jewish regime was defeated and expelled, and the Romans prevailed, basically what we know today as Palestinians have inhabited that region since then. Well, the real irony is that many of the Israelis, the Zionists that come back in, claiming that this is their historical homeland, well, they came out of Ukraine, Poland, and Russia, which has nothing to do with what we now know as the West Bank or Gaza. And it's really you've brought in a large number of European Jews in the wake of the Holocaust, but even when you go back and look at the early leaders, the terrorists that were involved. Yitzhak, you had Begin, Menachem Begin, head of the Irgun, and he was involved with carrying out terrorist attacks. He came out of Europe. So the Palestinians have been facing relentless attacks by these Zionists for over 70 years. And then when people who inhabit a land that are being attacked by outsiders naturally rise up and resist, all of a sudden they get the label of terrorism. Now, to make it even more cynical, with the emergence of Hamas in around 1987, the Mossad immediately interjected itself to fund Hamas for the simple purpose of being able to use Hamas as a wedge, as a tool to dilute the ability of the Palestinian liberation authorities to come up with a genuine peace agreement. So they were always using Hamas as a way to undermine the Palestinian leadership. The irony of what has happened since the October 7th, I describe it as a military raid. It was not a terrorist attack. It was primarily a military raid. Is that it has strengthened Hamas even beyond anything that has existed historically, that they enjoy greater support today than at any time in the past. So Israel has really created a bit of a problem for itself, and most of the world refuses to recognize or acknowledge, or let's say most of the Western world refuses to recognize or acknowledge the role that Israel itself played in creating and sustaining Hamas.
Yeah, and I always say we don't take any sides on the Muckrakers. We try to unpack our only mistress, if you like, is the truth, and any casualty on either side is an absolute tragedy.
Absolutely.
News is
I agree.
evolving all of the time. Netanyahu has vowed revenge as Hamas hands over the bodies of some of the youngest hostages. We've had infant, hope I pronounced the name correctly, Kafir Bibas and 4-year-old brother Ariel are said to be among 4 bodies handed over under the Gaza ceasefire terms. What's your take on that, Peter?
Well, commendably, you say, let's look at the facts. And the fact is that it's highly likely that those 4 Israelis were killed by the IDF with the IDF's relentless bombing. We know that over 50,000 Palestinians were killed, and it would hardly be surprising if there were some of the Israeli hostages who also sadly met their end. Netanyahu is, I think, just trying to milk the situation for propaganda purposes. He breathes fire, but I think we always have to look at actions more than words. And what we've seen since the eruption of Trump on the Gaza scene, forget the words, forget the rhetoric. What we have actually seen is progress, not just a ceasefire, but progress towards an eventual longer-term settlement. Half of the hostages have now been released. Hundreds of Palestinian prisoners have been released. The sides are very soon about to move to the second phase of exchanging prisoners, and this will be accompanied by the full withdrawal of the Israeli army from Gaza. These are the facts, and you have to say thank you to Trump, whatever his ultimate intentions may be as regards Gaza, to turn it into a Riviera resort or whatever, but the result is good for Palestinians and good for Israelis. The fighting has stopped, the temperature has dropped, people are being reunited with their loved ones, and there is modest cause for hope. So the second phase, thanks to Trump, will now likely go ahead, and then attention is already beginning to turn to the third phase, which is supposed to be the long-term future of Gaza, with 2 specific issues: reconstruction, where the Saudis and other Gulf countries are being looked to, and where they are in fact limbering up to contribute vast amounts to reconstruction. And the second subject, of course, is governance. Who will actually govern Gaza? And this is by far the most important thing, because the Israelis say that there can be no place for Hamas, but Hamas are not going anywhere. And to root out Hamas, the Israelis would have to march right back into Gaza with everything that would entail in terms of regional upset, and most important of all, upsetting the Donald, who portrays himself commendably as a man of peace. The Donald wants to see an attempt at long-term peace in Gaza and Palestine given a fair shot. So I suspect that in the next time we speak and the time after that, Hamas will still be there in Gaza, and I would not put a date on their eradication.
Okay. We're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to look a bit further about how fragile the current truce is, but also look at the Iranian hostages on another side of the world. Do not touch that dial.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers. Today's news talk, The Pulse.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers. Me, Andrew Eborn. I'm delighted to be joined by Larry Johnson and Peter Ford, and we're looking at the current situation both in Ukraine, in Gaza, and in the Middle East generally. I want to come to you, Larry. After 15 months of war, a ceasefire is in place. How fragile do you think this truce is, and what are the risks of it unraveling amidst US proposals to relocate Palestinians?
Actually, I've been surprised that it's as solid as it is. And, and it's partly is explained by, one, the intervention of Donald Trump, and specifically sending Stephen Witkoff as his envoy. Witkoff is not intimidated at all by Bibi Netanyahu. And Trump now has, there was always some concern at the outset that Trump was beholden to the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, the Jewish lobby in the United States. Well, the reality is he's actually got some freedom now because he can't stand for re-election. He's limited constitutionally. This is his last term. And I think he realizes also by virtue of his age, he doesn't want to spend the rest of his life toiling away in the White House, number one. But number two, Israel itself, through the Israeli Defense Force, has suffered terribly at the hands of Hamas. And yet we've exploded the myth of the IDF. Because think about it. Over the last 15 months, they have failed to defeat a militia. Hamas may have 30,000 members, but they're still a militia. They carry light arms. They're not carrying heavy weapons at all. They have a few mortars. They don't have artillery. They don't have tanks. They don't have armored vehicles. They don't have airplanes, combat aircraft. They don't have helicopters. Their missile supply is somewhat crude. But here is Israel, who had every tactical advantage any army in the world could ever have. They had their enemy confined to an area 21 miles long by 5 miles wide. They had them contained. They covered this, completely surrounded. They controlled all access. They controlled all logistics. They had aircraft. They both fixed wing and rotary wing, artillery, tanks, armored personnel carriers. And they failed to defeat Hamas. That ought to be a wake-up call, so people come out of this magical thinking that the Israelis are somehow some mighty foe. What they've proven is not only their ineptitude, but the number of casualties. I've seen some credible reports from a friend of mine, who I'm sure you two gentlemen would know, that the actual casualties the Israelis incurred is more like 5,000 dead, not 800 that they're reporting. And even the 800 number, if that's even that taken as accurate, when you put it into the context of, say, like New York City area is about the same size as Israel in terms of population. Can you imagine the uproar that would take place in the United States, in New York City, if 800 police officers were killed in 1 year? That would be an incredible slaughter. It's not, Israel's not doing well out of this.
Yeah, you make some very interesting points. Well, we talk about, Hamas are releasing hostages in phases, yet tensions obviously still remain. How much control does Hamas still wield in Gaza, and what does this mean for its future governance, Peter?
Hamas, before the conflict, were in total control. Right now, they're still in fairly full control, but there is looting, or there has been. There are clans, there are armed gangs. Policing a war zone is next to impossible. The miracle is that Hamas are still there at all. And as things calm down somewhat, Hamas are asserting themselves more, as we see in the videos coming out. At one point, a year or so ago, the Israelis were toying with the idea of creating a clan-based military opposition to Hamas. This was another example of wishful, magical thinking. The reality is that Hamas are effectively running a condominium with the United Nations in Gaza, and that is the most likely thing to happen in the months and possibly years ahead.
And it is interesting. We talk about the years ahead. I mean, I'm always trying to look at what peace might look like. What do you think peace might look like, Larry?
Well, let me go with what I hope it looks like. I think at some point the idea would be to have Russia, China, and the United States come to an agreement to step in and separate the parties and provide secure boundaries, that it wouldn't be the Israelis patrolling the boundaries of Gaza. It would be a genuine multinational force of big boys, big girls. We don't want to send Ghana or troops from Kenya to do this. Well, let's put the frontline forces out of China, Russia, and the United States together, working to, when the big three come together to impose a peace to separate them. The biggest problem is going to be on the Zionist side. The settlers are crazed, and there are close to 1 million of them, and so getting them corralled is going to be a big problem, and getting them out of the West Bank in particular. So I don't harbor any illusion that this is somehow going to be easy. I fear the most likely outcome right now, I think, is Israel's been in the process of destroying itself. If you compare the political situation within Netanyahu's party and what Netanyahu's facing with what Hamas is facing, I think you might come to the conclusion that you'd rather be Hamas than Netanyahu, even though the public popular perception is that Netanyahu is doing well. But right now he's facing serious allegations from Shin Bet that they were taking money from the Qataris, and people that work for him were taking money out from Qataris, and they are serving some foreign interests. So I mean, it's going to be just a real mess in Israel in the next 6 months.
I think a real mess is the thing, isn't it? Peter, what does peace look like for you?
Well, I'm not optimistic. I think the Israelis will be stubborn. They will not accept outsiders coming in to hold the ring. I think things will just meander on, go back to the way they were before. The population of Gaza will continue to suffer privation. The Israelis will not allow in reconstruction materials. This was a problem going back a number of years anyway, but the Gazans are incredibly resilient. They're already using rubble to create new and to repair existing buildings. If it's necessary, they'll live in tents and porta cabins, and an amazing amount can be done just in terms of repair. I say this with some knowledge of the situation because when I was working for UNRWA, this was one of my main jobs, to fundraise for Gaza reconstruction after a previous Israeli onslaught. And the most effective program we had was one called self-help. We just gave the Gazans money and they got on with the job. Small repairs, and many thousands were accommodated this way. It's not necessary to have massive billion-dollar reconstruction programs. The people of Gaza are used to coping with little. And if you just project the status quo forward, the trajectory we're on is the trajectory we will stay on. The Israelis will withdraw behind the border, continue to huff and puff, but I'd be surprised if they mounted a full-scale onslaught again, not least for the military reasons that Larry explained so clearly.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. In the last few minutes, I want to just talk about Iran and Craig and Lindsay Foreman, a British couple detained in Iran while motorbiking across the world, are the latest UK nationals caught in Tehran's grip. How do you think the UK government should respond to this escalation in Iran's hostage diplomacy? Let's start with you, Larry.
Well, I think Iran has been facing a concerted terrorist attack from the West, including from, both the United States, United Kingdom, and Israel over the last 20 years. The claim that Israel is the #1 sponsor of terrorism in the world, frankly, it's laughable, because if you consult the U.S. State Department's annual report on terrorism, it used to be called Patterns of Global Terrorism when I worked in the Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism, but today it's called Country Reports on Terrorism. Over the last 20 years, consistently, except for the last year, there are no groups linked to Iran listed in the top 10 most active terrorist groups. All the most active terrorist groups are Sunnis, backed by Gulf states, by Saudi Arabia, by Kuwait, by Qatar, not by Iran. Iran gets designated because they provided support to Hamas and Hezbollah, but I can even take you through the statistics provided by the Israeli Foreign Ministry that demonstrate that the number of, quote, terrorist attacks linked to Hamas over a 24-year period, according to the Israelis' own statistics, is 105 in a 24-year period. Not exactly a tidal wave of terrorism. So here is Iran, who has faced consistent, they had, between 2010 and 2012, they had 6 of the nuclear scientists assassinated. Over the last 2 years, they've witnessed assassinations. When they go back to Donald Trump, last 6 years, the assassination of General Soleimani, followed by the assassination of other high-level Iranian officials by the Israelis. So, Israel, frankly, Iran's been more the victim here than the perpetrator. But it is convenient for the West to always portray Iran as the problem, instead of the West taking responsibility for its own intelligence activities to try to foment unrest. I haven't even talked about Baluchistan, where the CIA has had long-standing operations there. Heavens, going back, to my knowledge, 40, 50 years.
Yeah, I know family and friends of Craig Foreman and Lindsay Foreman will be watching this program because they have been in touch. Anna Diamond, a former British Iranian detainee, she's called Iran's regime hostage takers. How much leverage, Peter, do you think the UK has to negotiate the release without conceding to Tehran's demands?
Well, as with the Russians, let's try to understand the other side. Why have they done this? And I believe there was a clue just 2 days ago when the Iranian foreign minister went to Doha, capital of Qatar. And after meeting the Qataris, came out, gave a press conference and said, my purpose in coming was to press the Qataris to release the $7 billion of Iranian funds, which are in Qatari custody, placed there by the Western powers, which refused to return Iranian funds, reserves, which had been placed in Western banks. But the funds have been put in kind of holding account in Doha. And the Iranians want their own money back. The correct response, therefore, would be some quiet diplomacy to agree quickly. The British ought to agree quickly with the Americans and possibly the French that it's time to give the Iranians back their own money, and then British citizens will not be put at risk.
Yeah, I mean, you make an interesting point. I mean, previously, the UK paid, I think, around 400 million in 22 to free Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe and Anousheh Ashuri. Do you think then, Larry, that this precedent encourages Tehran to keep targeting British nationals like the Foreman's for financial or political gain?
Well, no, I think as Peter eloquently stated, if the West would simply leave Iran alone and stop attacking it and stop trying to, seize assets and overthrow the government. That's been one of the sort of other benefits of Donald Trump's ascension to power. He knew something about USAID. I don't know at what point over the last, because I left the agency in 1989 and had been involved with covert action at that time. We didn't really use USAID back then, but some point in the intervening years, since really 1996, USAID became really a critical component in the CIA's overseas activities to undermine governments. And it is certainly very active in Iran. Iran has actually been trying to cultivate ties with the West. And let's not forget that in the 1980s, it was Israel that went to Ronald Reagan requesting permission to sell Iran American weapons because they wanted to fight Iraq. If I'm an Iranian or Iraqi, I got to look at the West as if they're crazy. They're schizophrenic. They play to both sides. There's no consistency and certainly no moral principle involved.
Yeah, no, you make some very interesting points. I mean, so as I say, the families and friends of the Foremans will be watching this program. What advice would you give to those people, Peter? What steps should they be taking? What can they do to help the situation?
Follow the example of the family of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. Exert a lot of public pressure. Demand that the British government talk about the release of these blocked Iranian funds. This is the Iranians' own money. And, what goes around comes around. You can't steal people's money and not expect consequences. Hostage taking is the weapon of the weak against the strong. It's always been like that from the age of the caveman. And this is what the Iranians are practicing. But there is a way out. It would cost us nothing, not a penny. We're not benefiting from blocking the Iranian funds. We do it just to spite them. Well, we should get over it and think about consequences for our own citizens. The family should make this link. The money. It's about the money, honey.
Okay. And keep the pressure on, keep the public pressure on, keep talking about it in the media on that sort of basis. Gentlemen, it's been an absolute delight as always, really helpful. Larry Johnson, Peter Ford, thank you so much for joining me here on the Muckrakers. We will get you back. You've promised me that you will come back and unpack the extraordinary situation that we live in. I'll be back with the rest of you at 5 o'clock tomorrow. Do join me then. But for now, thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.